So last week, I made a custom level for Super Mario Bros. Wonder using the Fushigi level editor. For a while now, I've had this idea of using the floating hoppos that appear during that one space section in the original game underwater. In order to make this a more convincing mechanic, I decided to add underwater goggles to the hoppos model. In fact, I took those from Kirby, which is also where I got the idea from in the first place. Hoppos alone aren't enough to make an interesting level, so after I discovered this interaction with the urchins, I decided to add them to the level as well. If I was going to have the hoppos and urchins float around underwater, I liked the idea of giving some kind of explanation for their movement, which is why I also decided to include water currents. Lastly, I had an idea for a wonder section that would involve the spike ball transformation, which is why I also included these domino blocks from the original game's spike ball level. So now that I had decided which mechanics I was going to use, it was time to start working on the level. Although a lot of my ideas for the level involved underwater sections, I decided to make a large part of it take place above water on the beach, since urchins and hoppos can only really interact outside of water. The domino blocks that I had decided to use have some pretty cool interactions with both enemy types as well, but those don't really work underwater at all either. Apart from a level's main mechanics, I think it's important that each level also has some random unique quirks. So for example, this level has multiple roulette blocks just to make it stand out a bit more. Something that Super Mario Bros. Wonder does, for the sake of realism I suppose, is that every body of water in the original game has background rocks behind it, so I made sure to stick to that idea in my level as well. I always try to learn something new about the game every time I make a new level. So for this one, I try to learn how movement assistant objects work, which are elements that attach to other objects to make them move around or rotate. Another thing I used a few times throughout this level is Super Mario Bros. Wonder's ability to bind one object to another object. So I could attach stuff to the domino blocks, which would then fall over alongside the blocks. Throughout this level, there's a bunch of different things that look like they're getting pushed along by the water currents. However, for most of those, I actually faked that effect by attaching those objects to invisible rails instead. Although things like urchins or coins can actually get pushed by water currents regardless, I found that this type of movement was slightly inconsistent and hard to predict, so I decided to play it safe by determining their movement ahead of time. For the level's underwater sections, I still wanted to stick to that water with the background rocks rule, so I decided to include these big background walls from one of the original game's water levels. The problem with making a level that's half above water and half underwater is that not every mechanic will be able to function properly in both circumstances. Therefore, throughout the level, I had to come up with some clever tricks to include the domino blocks in an underwater segment, or to keep the water current mechanic relevant even during the above water sections. Even still, the integration of the domino blocks isn't entirely seamless, because when one falls into the water, it doesn't slow down at all, even though I feel like that would be what would logically happen in that situation. At least most of the other mechanics that I'd chosen could work in both environments. For example, those water turtle enemies, which are called snortuses apparently, work both above water and underwater. Although, then again, even though I came up with this whole level because of the underwater hoppo idea, it's not like that underwater hoppos thing really even does that much. Like, sure, you can bump into them, which might then launch you into something else that could then damage you, but that basically just means they're urchins with extra steps. Anyways, I do think this idea of having shorter underwater segments in between beach sections is a good way of making sure the player doesn't get bored of the underwater stuff as easily. Something that's kind of funny about the hoppos is that I don't think there's a proper way of spawning them as stuck between two pieces of terrain by default. So for the few instances throughout this level where I wanted them to be bouncy platforms from the get-go, I just placed them right above the hole that they were supposed to fall into and hoped it would line up. The way that Super Mario Bros. Wonder's levels are usually divided up using one or more checkpoints is kind of weird thanks to the Wonder effect. For example, this level ends with a pretty big and lengthy Wonder segment that the player completely skips if they don't get the Wonder Flower. So should the checkpoint flag be halfway through the normal part of the level, completely ignoring the Wonder effect? Or should the Wonder segment be taken into account, even if that places the midway very far into the level? Since this level ended up having a Wonder segment where it's basically impossible to die, I didn't feel that bad about placing the midway flag halfway through the normal part of the level, but it's something that's worth keeping in mind. I had this idea for a segment where the player would chase a power-up as it gets pushed along by water currents, but considering most of the power-ups power-ups in the level were already kind of hard to get thanks to the roulette blocks, I decided to make this power-up chase into more of just a power-up delivery system, which is at least still a nice way of keeping the water current mechanic relevant during the beach part of the level. Since I knew this would be the last normal above water segment of the level, that meant that this basically had to feature the culmination of the above water mechanics, which led to the creation of a sort of strange setup which involved a domino block, an urchin, and a hoppo. So this level has a lot of the same camera trickery that I learned to use for my previous level, where the level will suddenly switch from progressing horizontally to vertically. But I suppose I never really explained what the tricks behind that kind of stuff really are. The main thing that you have to consider when it comes to changing the direction in which the camera scrolls is that it should happen as seamlessly as possible. Ideally, the player doesn't even notice. The problem with that is that the camera will always follow the player's movements, so if the player moves into the place where that transition from horizontal to vertical would be super obvious, it would look really weird. Therefore, the solution is to never allow the player to enter the inside corner of the part where the camera switches. So you'll notice that throughout this level, whenever the player goes into or comes out of the water, there's always this big chunk of terrain in the way, forcing them to move up or down and allowing the camera to move into position properly. I'm not sure if that explanation made sense. It's honestly a really weird system, but at least I fully understand it myself now. Anyways, at this point in the level, we also reached the culmination of the underwater mechanics, so now the urchins and hoppos are seemingly getting pushed around by the water current. Like I mentioned previously, this was achieved by attaching them to rails, which are like invisible versions of the Super Mario Maker tracks, only with more options and smooth movement. This level was actually the first time that I've used Super Mario Bros. Wonder's rail system, but it wasn't as complicated or annoying to work with as I expected ahead of time. The most tedious thing about them is definitely that Fushigi, the Super Mario Bros. Wonder level editor, still doesn't fully support editing a rail's properties. For the most part, that was fine, since most of the rails throughout this level worked using the default properties, but in a few instances that meant I had to open up the level as a text file and edit things manually. I don't know if I've explained this before, but so far when making these custom Super Mario Bros. Wonder levels, I basically just edit one of the original game's levels, mostly so I can use its backgrounds. That also tends to affect my own level's design. For example, the level that I was editing to make this level came with 2 areas that had beach backgrounds and 1 area that had an underwater background. So that's why I decided to include a fully underwater bonus room. The idea behind that bonus room was pretty simple, but I suppose compared to most of the original game's bonus rooms, it was actually quite elaborate. It's basically a water current obstacle course with the added twist that you're chasing the purple 10 coin throughout the whole thing. And if you're not fast enough, the coin will fall into a pit. Something pretty funny about the way I designed this section is that I found a massive problem with it while I was trying to record the video showcasing the level, when I thought the level was already completely done. Somehow, I'd never ended up in this room with the elephant power-up. I guess I always took damage on my way here, which meant that I didn't realize that Elephant Mario won't squeeze into 2-block tall corridors underwater. That's still kind of okay for the parts where the player can duck, but this meant that it was impossible for the player to get through the second turn where the corridor starts at the ceiling. Once again, the 10 coin in the bonus room also doesn't actually follow the water currents on its own like that. This was also done by attaching it to rails. The final part of the level before the wonder section really isn't anything interesting in terms of design. It was mostly made so I could integrate the idea I had for the level's wonder flower. Because the level used a lot of roulette blocks, it made complete sense to also put the wonder flower into a roulette block, just like one of the original game's levels does. But I wanted to take things one step further, so I also made a setup where the wonder flower would then get pushed around using some more water currents, and this is also the one time in the level where that's actually the wonder flower's actual movement and not like rails doing that. This final above ground bit still has the big background wall because I like the idea of the player sort of bursting out of this cave if they got the wonder transformation. So now it was time to start working on the wonder transformation section. I decided that this first half of it should be a pretty typical spike ball segment where the player can mow through a bunch of enemies and blocks and stuff like that. The original game's spike ball segment actually covers more than half of the level that it's a part of, but I knew from the start that I wasn't going to make my section that big. Honestly, the Spikeball Wonder effect isn't really that interesting. It's basically just a Starman section with slightly different controls, so I don't think dragging it out for too long was a good idea. Still, I did have a few ideas up my sleeve. For example, I obviously had to combine the Spikeballs with the Hoppos, even though actually the Spikeball doesn't even really bounce any higher when it jumps off of the Hoppo, but whatever. Sadly, during testing, I discovered that the Spikeball transformation completely ignores urchins. Like, you'll just roll right through them without them being defeated, so that's why they don't appear in this section at all. I knew from the start that I wanted the second half of the level's Spikeball section to take place underwater and feature a bunch of water currents, but I basically came up with this huge vertical section on the spot. The idea of the player suddenly crashing through the sand and ending up underwater, when most people might think that the Spikeball doesn't even work underwater, just seemed like such a cool opportunity to surprise the player. This whole section definitely prioritized spectacle over gameplay though. I don't think this is that obvious when you watch the gameplay, but the Spikeball can actually barely even move left or right when you're going through the vertical drop section. Still, I could just barely integrate this simple thing of having the player follow some mini purple coins to fall into a section that features a bunch more coins. Originally, I wanted this underwater part to be more of a maze of water currents going all over the place, but after I came up with this vertical section, I felt like that might sort of kill the momentum of the whole thing. So instead, I made this pretty simple final section where the player can collect some more coins and then get stuck in a water current loop where you can jump to grab the Wonder Seed. This whole section basically doesn't feature any challenges, but something that I haven't mentioned yet is that this is supposed to be one of the first levels in the mod that I'll hopefully end up including this level in. So I think the fact that the level as a whole is pretty easy is actually totally fine. Usually I make my levels way too difficult, so I don't mind this. Anyways, the last thing I had to make for this level was the goal pole section. The challenge to reach the top of the flagpole was a pretty obvious setup in this case. There's an urchin bouncing on a hoppo that you can just barely bounce over top of yourself using another hoppo. I also made the player enter through the water currents if they got the wonder effect, which I think is a pretty neat touch. Now there are only really two things left, adding more decoration to the level and adding in the talking flowers. Integrating the talking flowers requires a lot of looking back and forth between multiple different files and programs, not to mention a lot of playtesting, so I never really end up recording that bit. I did run into some problems adding the decorations into this level. It's a bit complicated to explain, but basically it meant that I couldn't include any wavy coral decorations throughout the level, but that's no big deal. Anyways, now that the level is basically done, let's go check it out in-game. Okay, so finally here we are in-game. So we have two of the main mechanics right at the start here, the domino block and the hoppo. And I think it's interesting that we also have a roulette block towards the beginning here, because that means that even if you start the level as a small player, like without any kind of power-up, you still get the opportunity to get the elephant suit, which I think is a good thing because we also have those like grey water wonder buds throughout the entire level, which just gives you some coins if you do have the elephant suit. And I think that's fine because I'm pretty sure Nintendo also usually just kind of scattered those throughout the levels without any kind of like real like hidden element to them. They're usually just all over the place basically. I'm a big fan of this 10 coin here, just the way that you kind of combine a lot of the level's different mechanics into one pretty simple collectible like that. I guess it sort of introduces the water current mechanic, which is going to become a much more prominent thing later on. In fact, I suppose you could argue with how much the water currents are like important in the wonder effect as well. I feel like maybe the water currents have ended up being the main mechanic of this level because they're definitely more prominent than the hoppos in the underwater segments. So yeah, I don't know. Anyways, I do hope people are fine with the fact that this is an underwater level, especially because this is also going to be one of the first levels in the mod that I'm hopefully going to include this level in. Because, yeah, I know a lot of people don't really like underwater levels by default, but personally, I'm fine with them so long as they're designed well, but I just feel like Nintendo often doesn't design their underwater levels that well. Like, it feels like they have, like, a different design team for the underwater levels that just makes them way more boring. I like having the static urchins there just as a little bit of a threat to make the water currents, like, slightly interesting, I suppose. If you hit that power up in the roulette blocks like slightly differently, the power up will actually go around the water current setup there and do a few loops before it ends up outside of it again. I think it's really funny. It is interesting how we have the midway here so early in the level. Like we're maybe a third of the way through the level if we consider it as playtime and not as size. But I think I talked about this during the time lapse. I guess that's fine because the level as a whole is quite easy, and especially the wonder section is very easy. So yeah, I suppose it doesn't really matter where you place the checkpoints. It's just and I mean, Wonder also does stuff like that, right? Where like the checkpoint is like at a ridiculous spot. So yeah, I guess it doesn't really matter. Anyways, here we have like the final cool setup with the above water mechanics, and it's really funny how this works out here with the urchin rolling back and forth. And we also have another one of those grey wonder buds there, just to make things a little bit more interesting. And yeah, it's funny how those coins there, they just follow the gravity of the water currents like that by default. I think that's really cool. And here we have one more roulette block water current setup, because I guess I just couldn't resist that sort of combination. I like this Hoppo here, just kind of casually chilling in the water currents. Like, he's not even really that much of a threat. I kind of tried to do something with it with those spikes down below, but yeah, whatever. We can also hit that block there with our trunk, but I like showing it off with the shell more, I suppose. And this section here, it's actually quite difficult to do this section as the elephant power-up. Also, look to the right there. That's really cool, right? The way those urchins get pushed up by the water currents. But yeah, this is really oh god, this is this is quite difficult to do damageless as the elephant power-up transformation because the hitbox is so tall. And speaking of the elephant's taller hitbox, yeah, if we were the elephant right now, we'd have to like duck in this section, which looks really awkward. So I'm probably gonna go back and fix that at some point if I ever end up like messing with this level a little bit more. We'll have to see about that, I guess. Something that I don't think I've talked about before is the fact that the roulette block here actually has a different graphic. You see that like orange wonder flower that, you know, is typical for the Petal Isles. If I didn't change that, that would actually be the black and purple wonder flower of World 6, because that's the only type of wonder flower that's normally displayed in the roulette block in the original game. Anyways, now we have the wonder transformation. And I should probably actually showcase the what's past the secret here, or what's past the normal route, which is a secret. But yeah, we have some bouncing Hoppo stuff. It's very easy to do that without bouncing on the Hoppos. Let's see if I can pull this off. There we go. Those background rocks actually indicate where the gap in the terrain is, and yeah, we just got a little one up there. But yeah, I do hope that people like this underwater thing here, because I mean, you can barely even move around like I talked about during the time lapse, but it's still just it's a spectacle, you know. It's a form over function or whatever. But I think that's fine, and I mean, I still managed to integrate like that little secret there with the coins, so I suppose it's okay. This section here can actually be quite tricky, like getting this jump for the wonder seed. Let's see if we can. Oh no, let's give that another shot. No, oh, okay, there we go. Yeah, it's actually it can be quite tricky to do that jump there, because jumping from the bottom there, I think is the only way of actually getting that wonder seed in that room there. And I really like the detail of how we come up from the water currents like that. But yeah, I suppose that's the end of this level, and also the end of this video. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and maybe also check out the Wonderland server linked in the description. Thank you guys so much for watching, see you later, and bye bye!